I never told my daughter-in-law that I earned $40,000 a month. She thought I was just a simple old man fixing neighbors' faucets, clipping coupons at the grocery store, wearing the same worn jacket my late wife Eleanor gave me 15 years ago. And I let her believe it. Because sometimes you learn more about people when they think you have nothing to offer. When Vanessa invited me to dinner with her parents, I knew exactly what was coming. The polite smiles, the condescending questions, the subtle looks that said, "This is the best your father could do." So, I played the part. I wore my oldest suit. I drove my 20-year-old sedan. I walked into their marble-floored mansion, with my head down, my shoulders slightly hunched, the perfect image of a humble, naive father who didn't belong in their world. But the moment I crossed that threshold, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Hanging on their wall, encased in gold like a trophy, was a framed magazine cover. Morgan Industries Building Empires, since 1995. The same company that destroyed my wife, the same people who buried her truth and walked away without a scratch. They had no idea who I was, no idea what I knew, no idea that the poor old man standing in their foyer was about to dismantle everything they'd built, brick by carefully placed brick. Because revenge isn't about anger, it's about patience. And I'd been patient for 15 years. Stay with me. You won't believe what I did next. My name is Charles Bennett. I'm 61 years old, a financial consultant who's been retired in everything but name. I still work quietly from home, advising a few clients who trust me with their portfolios, though most days I prefer silence to numbers. 15 years have passed since my wife Eleanor died, and I still live in the same old cedar-shingled house where we raised our son. It's small, quiet, and smells faintly of lemon oil and coffee. Eleanor used to say a home should sound like its people. Mine sounds like memory. Each morning I start the day with two rituals: coffee in the chipped mug she bought at a yard sale, and a few words to her photograph on the mantel. The picture is fading around the edges now, Eleanor, in a white sweater, smiling like she knew something I didn't. "Good morning, love," I say every day. "Don't worry, I'm still here." She never answers, of course, but I swear the house listens for her. Some mornings I even catch myself asking her advice whether I should take a client or prune the old magnolia tree, or forgive Ethan for the latest slight. Ethan is my son, my only child. He was 5 when Eleanor and I brought him home, a bundle of fear and stubborn pride. We never told him he was adopted. There never seemed to be a reason. He was ours in every way that mattered. But somewhere along the road to adulthood, Ethan grew restless. He wanted more, bigger houses, bigger cars, louder friends. I was proud at first, then uneasy, and now, if I'm honest, mostly sad. I live quietly on my income, though no one knows the real number. My neighbors think I'm a retired accountant who scrapes by on savings. Even Ethan doesn't know. I make $40,000 a month consulting. I never saw the point in telling him. Money never healed distance. It only widened it when pride got in the way. Eleanor would have told me to keep that truth tucked away like good china, useful only when it truly matters. Ethan lives 20 minutes away in a glass and steel townhouse that looks like an architect's trophy. His wife, Vanessa, is the sort of woman who photographs her meals and her reflections in the same frame. She's charming when she wants to be cruel, when she doesn't have to be. Still, she has a way of making Ethan feel important, and I can't blame him for wanting that. The few times I've visited, I've seen how she looks at me like an antique chair that doesn't match the room but is too heavy to throw away. I don't hold it against her. Not really. The world changed and people like me became invisible unless we had something to show for our lives. My house doesn't impress anyone. The porch needs sanding, the roof leaks when it rains sideways, and the mailbox leans like an old man. But it's mine, paid off decades ago, and every flaw reminds me of the years Eleanor and I patched it together with love and paint thinner. Sometimes I think about selling it, moving closer to the city where Ethan lives, but I know he wouldn't visit more often. He's too busy building an image, chasing an idea of success that Eleanor never would have recognized. "He's young," she used to say. "He'll find his balance." I hope she's right, though. Lately, that hope feels thin as paper. That Tuesday, I was organizing old files when the phone rang. I still keep a landline. Something about hearing a real ring makes me feel grounded. I expected a client. Instead, it was Vanessa. "Hello, Charles," she said, her tone smooth, deliberate. She never calls me Dad. "Ethan and I were talking, and we'd love to have you over for dinner this weekend. My parents will be visiting." It would mean so much if you came. For a moment, I said nothing. It wasn't the invitation itself that stunned me. It was the practiced politeness in her voice, the kind you use with strangers you need to impress. "That's thoughtful of you," I replied. "What's the occasion?" She laughed softly. "No occasion, just family. And, my parents are traditional people. They appreciate simplicity, humility. You know." I smiled into the empty room. "I'll be sure to bring both." "Perfect," she said quickly. "Oh, and maybe wear something formal. My father's particular about presentation. It's just who he is." "Of course," I said, though I could almost hear Eleanor's sigh behind me. After she hung up, I stared at the phone a long time. The word family echoed in my head, hollow as an unfurnished room. I walked to the mantel, touched the edge of Eleanor's frame. "Did you hear that, love?" I murmured. "They want me to meet the royal family." The photograph caught a slant of afternoon light, her smile frozen mid-laugh. I could almost hear her answer, gentle, amused. "Be kind, Charles. But keep your eyes open." I spent the evening walking through the house, straightening what didn't need straightening. I took my old suit from the closet, navy wool, a little tight in the shoulders, and brushed off the dust. I thought about buying a new one, then decided against it. If they wanted to see who I was, they'd see the truth. A man can't wear new cloth over old scars. Outside, the wind shifted through the magnolia tree. The petals fluttered down like pale confetti, landing on the porch steps Eleanor once scrubbed by hand. I stood there until the sun went down, thinking about dinners and strangers and the way people judge each other without saying a word. When the phone rang again later that night, it was Ethan. His voice was thin with tension. "Dad, about Saturday. Just try to make a good impression, okay? Vanessa's parents can be formal." I wanted to ask formal or cruel, but instead said, "Don't worry, son. I'll be on my best behavior." He sighed in relief, thanked me, and hung up. I stayed by the phone long after listening to the dial tone. Eleanor's portrait watched me from the mantel, calm and knowing. "A dinner," I whispered to her. "That's all it is. Just dinner." But deep down, I knew better. I sensed it wasn't a dinner invitation, it was an evaluation. The next afternoon, Ethan showed up without warning. I saw his car from the window before he even reached the porch, a silver sedan that gleamed like it had never seen a gravel road. He stepped out carefully, straightening his jacket, glancing at the peeling paint on my front door, as if it were an accusation. I opened it before he could knock. "Dad," he said, giving me a quick, practiced smile. "Mind if I come in?" His tone carried the politeness of a salesman, not a son. I gestured him inside. He hesitated at the threshold, brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve before following me into the kitchen. The old house always seemed smaller when he was in it, as though his discomfort bent the walls inward. He glanced around, his eyes landing on the coffee pot, the modest table, the stack of financial journals on the counter. "Smells the same," he said, though his voice lacked warmth. "Coffee and nostalgia." I smiled, ignoring the barb. "Some things don't need changing," I said. "Can I get you a cup?" "No thanks." He stayed standing, fiddling with his watch. "I just wanted to talk about Saturday. Vanessa's really excited to have you meet her parents." He paused, adjusting his tone. "They're particular people. Traditional, you know, they value presentation." I raised an eyebrow. "Presentation, yeah. Just, dressing well, carrying yourself confidently. It's not about money, it's about image." He looked away quickly, as if embarrassed by his own words. "You've always been a little casual about that stuff." I leaned back in my chair. "Casual," I repeated. "You mean poor?" No, that's not what I meant." He ran a hand through his hair. "It's just that appearances matter in their world. Vanessa's father built his reputation on it. They can be judgmental, but it's not personal." "Judgmental but not personal," I said, smiling faintly. "That's an interesting trick," he sighed. "Dad, please don't do this. I just want the evening to go smoothly. Vanessa's been stressing about every detail, the wine, the seating, the menu. I promised her you'd fit in." "Fit in," I echoed, tasting the words. "Like a puzzle piece in someone else's picture." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You know what I mean?" "Do I?" I asked softly. "Because it sounds like you're asking me to be someone else for them." He exhaled, frustrated. "It's not about pretending. It's about respect. You raised me to work hard to succeed. Well, this is part of success, knowing how to present yourself. I looked at him, seeing a man who had spent too long trying to prove something to people who would never care. Your mother used to say people only see what they want to see, I said. Maybe that's still true. He frowned. This isn't about Mom. Isn't it? I asked. She never needed to dress up to make people respect her. She earned it by being decent. Different times, Dad, he said sharply. The world's changed. You can't just be good, you have to look the part. Vanessa's parents will judge whether you like it or not. His voice softened, almost pleading. Please, Dad, just wear something nice. A suit, no sweater, and maybe don't talk about, he stopped himself. About what? About old times, he said quickly. Or finances. Or Mom. They're sensitive about emotional topics. I laughed quietly. Emotional topics? You mean human topics? He flinched as though I'd struck him. I'm just asking you to make an effort, he said, quieter now. For me. That softened me, if only a little. All right, I said. For you. He looked relieved, but still uneasy. Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd understand. He moved toward the door, glancing once more at the mantel where Eleanor's portrait hung. You still talk to her, he asked. Every day, I said. She's better company than most people I know. His lips pressed into a line. You've got to move on sometime. Maybe, I said. But moving on doesn't mean forgetting. He didn't answer. Outside the afternoon, light caught on the windshield of his car, flashing like a warning. Before he left, he hesitated again. Just remember, Dad, this dinner, it's important. Vanessa's father is a serious man. He respects confidence. Confidence, I repeated. I'll remember that. After he drove away, the house exhaled. Silence settled in like an old friend. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window watching the wind move through the magnolia tree. I thought about Ethan's nervous eyes, the way his words trembled between love and shame. He wanted to protect me from embarrassment, not realizing I'd already survived worse. I'd buried my wife. I'd raised a boy into a man who no longer recognized the man who raised him. A fancy dinner couldn't touch that kind of pain. The phone rang again that evening. Vanessa's name glowed on the screen. Charles, she began, her tone syrupy. Ethan said he stopped by. I just wanted to make sure you know how much we're looking forward to Saturday. My parents will adore you. They love simple, humble people. Down to earth, you know, real. I'm as real as they come, I said. She laughed lightly. I know. That's why I wanted to remind you, no need for anything extravagant. Maybe bring something homemade, that would be lovely. Something simple, I repeated. Exactly, she said. Oh, and don't feel pressured to dress too formally. Just neat. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the phone. Her words echoed humble people, simple, down to earth. I could almost hear Eleanor laughing from her frame on the wall, that low, knowing chuckle she used to have when someone underestimated her. I set my cup down, walked to the window again, and looked at my reflection in the glass. An old man stared back, calm, steady, and visible to the world he helped build. If they wanted humility, I would give them humility they'd never forget. Saturday evening arrived with a chill that didn't belong to the season. I stood outside the Morgans' mansion, the kind of house that didn't just sit on land but ruled over it. The driveway was lined with marble statues and perfectly trimmed hedges that looked as if they'd been measured with a ruler. The front doors were taller than any church doors I'd ever seen, and when they opened, the warm light inside hit me like a stage spotlight. Vanessa stood waiting in a silk dress that shimmered gold. Her smile was wide enough for photographs, not for people. Charles, you made it, she said, kissing the air near my cheek. You look comfortable. Her pause before the last word told me everything. Behind her, Ethan adjusted his tie, pretending not to notice. I handed her the small box of homemade cookies I'd baked that morning. For the table, I said. She blinked, unsure whether to laugh or thank me. How thoughtful, she said finally. Come in. My parents are dying to meet you. The foyer was a museum pretending to be a home. Every inch gleamed white marble floors, gold-framed mirrors, chandeliers dripping like icicles. The air smelled of polished wood and imported perfume. I wiped my shoes carefully on the rug, which seemed to offend Mrs. Morgan before she even appeared. Oh, don't bother, dear, she said as she glided down the staircase. It's just silk. She was tall, perfectly coiffed, wrapped in something that probably cost more than my car. "Vanessa has told us so much about you." I smiled. "I hope not everything." Mr. Morgan followed behind her, a barrel-chested man with a jaw built for commanding boardrooms. His handshake was brief, his eyes sharp. "So you're the famous father," he said, "the one who raised our charming daughter-in-law's husband." "That's me," I said. "The very same." He laughed once dryly. "I hear you're retired. Must be nice not having to worry about markets and margins." "I suppose it is," I said, though I caught the smirk in his tone, the kind that belongs to men who mistake kindness for weakness. We walked into the dining room where the table gleamed under a chandelier the size of a satellite. The plates were gold-rimmed, the napkins folded like origami swans. A servant poured wine before I'd even sat down. "Beautiful home," I said. Mrs. Morgan smiled thinly. "It's modest compared to some of our friends' places. But one must stay grounded, right?" Vanessa laughed a little too loudly. "Mother, you're terrible!" Ethan took the seat beside me, shifting uncomfortably. His hand brushed his napkin 3 times before he picked it up as if it might explode. "Dad, use the smaller fork for the salad," he whispered. "This one?" I asked quietly. No, the one on the left." "Wait, your left." He chuckled nervously, correcting me under his breath. Vanessa giggled, covering her mouth. "He's so endearing," she said to her parents. "He doesn't even try to impress anyone." "That's rare these days," Mr. Morgan said, cutting into his steak, though the salad hadn't yet arrived. "People who know their place." I smiled faintly. "I find it easier that way." The conversation flowed like a river of polite insults, smooth on the surface, sharp underneath. They asked about my little hobbies, whether I managed to stay busy, and if retirement was treating me kindly. Each question came coated in honey but stung like vinegar. Ethan tried to bridge the gap, talking about his work, his promotion, his plans. Every time I opened my mouth, he jumped in to steer the conversation elsewhere, terrified I might embarrass him by sounding ordinary. I let him. A man learns more from silence than interruption. When the main course arrived, the server placed a porcelain dish before me, something French and unpronounceable. I thanked him, earning another polite smile from Mrs. Morgan. "You're very courteous," she said. "I suppose that's where Ethan gets his charm." "Or maybe he got it from his mother," I replied. For a second, silence touched the table like a cold breeze. Vanessa recovered first. "Oh yes, Ethan mentioned she passed away years ago. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I said. "She was a remarkable woman." "And she worked?" Mr. Morgan asked, slicing his steak again. "What did she do?" "Accounting," I said. "For a firm called Morgan Industries. You might have heard of it." His knife froze mid-cut. Mrs. Morgan's smile stiffened. "Yes, that name sounds vaguely familiar," she said, glancing at her husband. Vanessa, oblivious, poured herself more wine. I took a sip of water, watching their faces. It was the first crack in the perfect facade. A moment later, Mrs. Morgan rose to fetch another bottle, her heels clicking against the marble. As she disappeared into the hall, I let my eyes wander around the room. That's when I saw it on a sideboard near the window, a framed photo in silver. It showed a group of young professionals smiling in front of a company banner. Eleanor was among them, radiant, her arm around a younger woman with kind eyes and a familiar name beneath Rebecca Lang. My chest tightened. Rebecca, the same name from the photograph in my house, the one Eleanor kept tucked in her wallet. I stood to get a closer look, pretending to admire the decor. The frame's plaque read, "Morgan Industries Employee Appreciation 1998. "Beautiful picture," I said when Mrs. Morgan returned. "You must have known many wonderful people back then." "Oh, that old thing," she said, lightly taking her seat. "We had hundreds of employees. I wouldn't remember them all." But her voice trembled slightly on hundreds. Ethan leaned in. "Dad, sit, please." His tone carried that pleading edge again. I obeyed, though my eyes stayed on the photo. The rest of the meal blurred together, fine wine, hollow compliments, the occasional correction from Ethan. I watched the Morgans hold court, their laughter echoing against marble walls. They spoke of markets and investments, of vacations and villas, of charities that served more for photographs than purpose. Every smile felt rehearsed, every toast choreographed. Vanessa sparkled like a trophy among them, and Ethan played his part well, nodding at the right times, laughing a beat late. I said little, just listened. People reveal more when they believe you're beneath them. Near dessert, Mrs. Morgan asked, "So Charles, what's your secret? You seem very at peace with your position in life." "Gratitude," I said. "I've learned to be grateful for what I have." "How noble," she said, as though nobility were a costume I'd borrowed for the night. Ethan shifted again, his knee bouncing under the table. I laid a hand on his arm. "It's all right," I whispered. He glanced at me confused. I looked around that glittering table at the silver cutlery, the crystal glasses, the polished pride that disguised rot. And as I raised my glass to them, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was curious to see what happened when the masks slipped. They dined like royalty, but I saw cracks beneath their golden plates. That night when I came home from the Morgans' mansion, the laughter from their dining room still echoed in my head. It followed me into the quiet of my house, thin and hollow like a ghost that refused to leave. I took off my jacket, loosened my tie, and stood for a long while in the doorway of my living room, staring at Eleanor's photograph. The same calm smile, the same knowing eyes. For the first time in years, I couldn't bring myself to speak to her. The truth was, I had seen something in that house, something that pulled me backward through time to the life we had before everything fell apart. I poured myself a small drink, sat down, and let the memory take me. It was 15 years ago, a gray Friday afternoon. The sky hung low over the city, heavy with rain. I'd driven to Morgan Industries to pick Eleanor up early. She'd called, her voice tight, saying she was wrapping up a few things. When I reached the lobby, the receptionist wouldn't meet my eyes. I remember the hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of burnt coffee, the sound of a woman crying behind a closed door. I pushed it open without knocking. Inside, Eleanor sat at a long oak table, her hands trembling on a stack of papers. Across from her stood Richard Morgan, thinner then, but with the same cold confidence I'd seen at dinner. He was speaking quietly, almost kindly, and that kindness made my stomach turn. "It's not permanent, Eleanor," he said. "Just a formality. You're the senior accountant. The audit trail ends with you. We'll fix it later." She looked up at him, her face pale. "You want me to sign off on the losses? To take the blame?" He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's a matter of optics. Someone needs to shoulder responsibility. You're respected here. It will blow over faster if it's you." "I did nothing wrong," she said. "Then be a team player," he replied. "You'll be compensated, of course." I stepped forward then. "Compensated," I said, my voice sharper than I meant. Both of them looked up. Charles, Eleanor whispered, standing quickly. Morgan smiled thinly. "Ah, the husband. You're not supposed to be here." "Apparently neither is honesty," I said. He straightened. "This is a private meeting." "Not anymore." Eleanor reached for my hand, her eyes pleading. "Please, let's go," she said. "It's done." But it wasn't done. She signed those papers that day, signed them with shaking hands, and when we left, she carried her box of personal things down the hallway like a condemned prisoner. Outside, the rain started. She stood there, her umbrella forgotten, and cried quietly while I tried to hold her together. "It's just temporary," she kept saying. "They said they'd fix it." But they never did. In the months that followed, she grew quieter. She stopped painting, stopped reading in bed, stopped laughing at my bad jokes. She would sit by the window long after midnight, staring into nothing. When I asked what haunted her, she'd only say, "Some mistakes follow you home." I told her it wasn't her fault. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. There were days I'd find her in her office, hands folded over old ledgers, staring at numbers that no longer mattered. I didn't understand then how deep her shame had gone. She was a woman of integrity, and Morgan Industries had turned that into a weapon. In the end, the guilt consumed her. After she passed, I packed away her belongings carefully, every paper, every photograph. But I never touched the safe in her study, the small gray box she kept locked with a code I never asked for. Tonight, standing in that same study with her laughter still ringing in my ears from memory, I knew it was time. I moved the books aside and pulled the safe from its place. My fingers hesitated on the keypad. It took 3 tries before I remembered the date she used for everything our wedding anniversary. The lock clicked open with a sound that broke something inside me. Inside were neatly stacked documents yellowed around the edges. Her handwriting curled across envelopes, patient and elegant. On top lay a letter marked, "Resignation, 2009. I unfolded it, and read. The words were polite, professional, but beneath them, I could feel the tremor of fear. She took responsibility for accounting discrepancies, thanked the company for opportunities given, and ended with a line that shattered me. I hope my departure will allow the firm to move forward without further scandal. Beneath that letter was another envelope, sealed but never sent. My name was written across it in her hand. I opened it slowly, afraid the air might break it. Inside was a short note, unsigned, unfinished. My dearest Charles, please forgive me. I thought I could fix it, but I only made things worse. Tell Ethan to live proudly. Tell him he was always meant to be ours. My throat closed. I sank into her old chair, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender and ink. For a long while I couldn't move. When I finally gathered the courage to look again, I noticed another document tucked at the bottom of the safe, a folded sheet of legal paper. It was the adoption certificate. Ethan Bennett, age 5. Adopted legally, irrevocably 15 years before the scandal. My hands shook as I held it. All these years, Eleanor had carried that guilt not just for herself, but for him, for us. I could see now that she'd tried to protect everyone, even the people who destroyed her. I ran my fingers over her signature and whispered into the silence. You didn't fail, Eleanor. They did. Outside, the wind rattled the magnolia branches against the window. I sat there until the moon climbed high, the safe opened beside me, its contents glowing under the lamplight like evidence in a trial that had taken too long to start. Ethan's laughter from his childhood echoed faintly in my head, the sound of a boy who never knew how hard his mother fought for him. I folded the documents carefully and placed them back inside, but not before tracing her name one last time. Ethan was never my blood, but he was my choice. By morning, the papers from Eleanor's safe still lay on my desk, their edges curled from the lamplight that had burned all night. I hadn't slept. Grief has a strange way of turning into clarity when the house is quiet enough. For 15 years, I'd lived as though Eleanor's death were an accident of fate, a sorrow without shape. Now I saw it for what it was, a wound with fingerprints. The Morgans had carved their success out of her ruin, and my silence had kept their hands clean. I stood in the dim light of dawn, staring at the magnolia tree through the window, its leaves trembling in the wind. Eleanor used to say that storms reveal what's rooted deepest. I thought about that as I gathered the letters, locked them away again, and washed the smell of paper and dust from my hands. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was noise. I needed quiet. Quiet was sharper. I spent the next few days moving carefully, as if the world might notice the shift inside me. I went to work on my laptop, opened accounts, reviewed portfolios, set up phone calls. To anyone watching, I looked like a retired man tinkering with old hobbies. But each document I opened was a step towards something I hadn't done in years: purpose. On Wednesday, I drove to my lawyer's office downtown. Tom Jenkins had handled my finances since before Ethan was born. A good man, honest enough to be trusted, cynical enough to know when not to ask questions. His office smelled of leather and coffee, the kind of place where secrets sat comfortably behind mahogany desks. He looked up from his computer when I entered. "Charles," he said, surprised, "you haven't darkened my door in over a decade." "Time to correct that," I replied, setting a folder on his desk. "I need to establish a trust." Quietly. He flipped open his notebook. "A trust for who?" "For Eleanor," I said. "In name, not in person." He studied me for a long moment. "What's this really about?" "Control," I said simply. "And protection." He nodded slowly, understanding more than I said. "You want it untraceable." "Exactly. Layered entities. Different jurisdictions if necessary. But it must appear legitimate, an investment group, low profile, clean records." "What do you want to call it?" he asked. I looked out the window at the skyline, the city gleaming in morning light. Eleanor Trust Holdings. He wrote it down. Funding source, private assets liquidated gradually. No loans, no outside investors. And your role, none. Officially, I don't exist. He gave a low whistle. "You're not planning anything illegal, are you?" I smiled faintly. "Illegal? No. Inconvenient for certain people, perhaps." He chuckled. "Charles, you always did have a talent for understatement." We went through the formalities, articles of incorporation, trustee appointments, confidentiality clauses. When he slid the final document toward me, I paused before signing. My pen hovered over the paper, and for a moment, I saw Eleanor's signature from her resignation letter, the tremor in her hand captured forever in ink. I pressed the pen down firmly and wrote my name. "Consider this," I said, a course correction. As I left the office, the air outside felt lighter, as if the city itself had taken a breath with me. I stopped at a grocery store on the way home, a habit I kept from simpler times. The automatic doors opened with a soft hiss, and the smell of fresh bread and citrus filled the air. I was standing by the produce section examining a basket of apples when a voice behind me said, "Well, Mr. Bennett, fancy seeing you here." I turned. Mrs. Morgan stood there in oversized sunglasses and a tailored coat, her shopping cart already half full of imported goods. She looked me up and down, her smile thin as paper. "I almost didn't recognize you without your charming dinner attire." "Good morning," I said, calm. "Shopping for the essentials, I see." "Oh, this," she gestured vaguely toward her cart. "Just a few things. We try to support local markets when we can." Her tone implied charity, not habit. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Vanessa tells me you live quite modestly. Admirable, really. Some people know how to stay in their lane." I met her gaze and held it. "Lanes can be deceiving," I said softly. "Sometimes the slow one leads farther than the fast." She blinked, uncertain if she'd been insulted. "Well," she said finally, "it's been lovely running into you. Do take care." She turned away, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving the faint scent of perfume and disdain behind her. I watched her go, something cold settling in my chest, not rage but resolution. She thought I was small. They all did. That was fine. I'd learned long ago that the most dangerous men were the ones nobody saw coming. I paid for my groceries, bagged them myself, and drove home in silence. That night I sat in my office with a single lamp burning. The paperwork for the trust lay spread before me. I reviewed each form meticulously, signing where needed, cross-checking every clause. It wasn't the money that mattered, it was the structure. The Morgans had built their empire on deceit and arrogance. I would build mine on precision and patience. When I was done, I leaned back, letting the pen fall from my hand. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, alive, purposeful. I looked toward Eleanor's photo on the mantel. "I'll do it right," I said aloud. No shouting, no threats, just truth delivered clean. Her smile seemed to soften in the lamplight. I thought about the Morgans sitting in their marble palace, believing the world bent to their will. They didn't know yet that their balance sheets were about to tremble. Every empire has an unseen investor, they just didn't know it was me. In the weeks that followed, the trust came to life like a quiet engine. What began as a stack of papers and signatures in my study became something invisible and powerful, humming beneath the surface of the world that had once humiliated me. I moved slowly, methodically, the way I'd been trained to handle delicate markets, never drawing attention, never overreaching. The trick to power I'd learned long ago was not to be loud, but to be present where no one looked. Through Eleanor Trust Holdings, I began acquiring pieces of Morgan Industries, tiny, unremarkable fragments at first. Shares no one noticed changing hands, each one tucked behind shell accounts and secondary brokers. It was the kind of maneuver that only a patient man could manage. I had been patient for 15 years. The company's stock had been sluggish for months, limping from one quarterly disappointment to another. They'd overextended chasing projects meant to impress investors instead of sustain them. All I had to do was wait for weakness, then move. Within 3 weeks, the trust owned enough silent influence to matter. Not control, not yet, but direction. It was like placing my hand on the company's pulse, feeling the beat, waiting for the moment to press down. I didn't need to storm their castle. I only needed to learn its rhythm. Ethan called one afternoon, his voice unusually strained. "Dad, do you have a minute?" "Always," I said, keeping my tone even. "What's going on?" "It's work," he said. "Vanessa's father asked me to help with some temporary authorizations. Just internal paperwork, nothing serious." He hesitated, then added, "He said it would show he trusts me with bigger responsibilities." "And you believe that?" I asked. "Of course," he said quickly. "It's just routine approvals. A few sign-offs for short-term funding transfers, project guarantees. Legal stuff." My stomach tightened. I'd read enough of Morgan Industries' filings to know what that meant, leveraging future capital against existing debt. I asked, "Did you read what you're signing?" "They explained it," he said, a little defensively. "Dad, this is a good thing." He said this could fast-track me to partner level. "It's an opportunity. Opportunity for who I wanted to say, but I bit back the words. Instead, I murmured, "Be careful, son. You're being invited to hold a ladder that someone else will climb." He laughed, nervously. "You always worry too much." "That's what fathers do," I said. When the call ended, I sat for a long while, the line still humming in my ear. Ethan didn't know he was standing on a trapdoor one his father-in-law had built long before he joined the family. The Morgans had no loyalty beyond their reflection in the mirror. They'd use Ethan as collateral the way they used everyone else, squeeze him dry of credibility, then cast him aside when he stopped shining. But saying that outright would only drive him closer to them. So I did the only thing that ever worked in business or in life. I stayed silent. Silence lets arrogance talk itself to death. I spent the next few days watching the markets. Morgan Industries was shifting again, liquidating small assets to cover larger ambitions. I traced the patterns, confirmed my suspicions, and made my next move. Through the trust, I bought another layer of shares, small, dispersed, harmless looking, but combined, they began to lean the balance in my direction. Every transaction was hidden behind legitimate firms, each one owned by someone who owed me a favor or never realized they were working for me. The Morgans thought they were tightening control over their empire. In reality, they were signing its surrender piece by piece. One evening, I drove past their downtown headquarters, the building glowing like a crown against the skyline. Inside those windows, people were still working late, numbers flickering across screens, emails flying through invisible wires, all feeding a machine I was slowly rewiring. I didn't feel triumphant, not yet. It was too early for that. What I felt was focus. This wasn't revenge in the way people imagined it. No shouting, no confrontation. This was restoration. Every dollar I moved was an act of balance, each decision a quiet correction to a crooked ledger. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. He'd called again the following week, his voice lighter. "The authorizations went through," he said. Mr. Morgan seemed pleased. "He told me, I have a real head for numbers. You'd like him if you gave him a chance." "I doubt that," I said. "He's different when you get to know him," Ethan insisted. "He's been mentoring me. He says family businesses stay strong when everyone pulls their weight." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Family businesses," I repeated softly. "Tell me, did he define who the family is?" "Of course," Ethan said. "All of us." "Good," I said, keeping my tone warm. "That's important." After we hung up, I turned back to my desk and opened the latest filings again. The temporary authorizations Ethan had mentioned were already reflected in the company's internal reports, short-term financial movements that redirected equity control into the hands of a proxy shareholder. My proxy. Ethan had signed the documents that effectively gave my trust its foothold inside their empire. I wondered what Morgan had told him to make it seem so harmless. Probably that it was just numbers, signatures, routine. That's how men like him worked. They disguised manipulation as mentorship. I printed the documents, highlighting the chain of transfers, tracing them like threads on a map. My hand didn't shake, but my pulse quickened. This was no longer about strategy. This was personal. They had made my son an accomplice to their own undoing. I closed the folder, leaned back, and let the quiet settle again. Silence had always been my ally. It gave shape to truth, exposed what noise tried to hide. In the silence, I could hear the faint creak of their empire beginning to bend. They thought Ethan was theirs, now molded and obedient. They thought he'd handed them my weakness. They thought they owned my son, not knowing I already owned them. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind that should have been peaceful. I was in the garden, trimming the magnolia branches, when I heard my phone vibrating on the porch rail. Ethan's name flashed across the screen. His voice, when I answered, was hoarse, fractured. "Dad," he said, and then nothing for a few seconds but the sound of his uneven breathing. "Are you home?" "I am," I said. "What's wrong? I need to talk to you." "Now." He hung up before I could ask anything else. 20 minutes later, his car screeched into the driveway, stopping so fast the gravel spat against the siding. He got out, still in his work clothes, shirt untucked, eyes wild and red-rimmed. He didn't bother to knock, just walked in like a man running from fire. "She said it." He began pacing the room. "She said it to hurt me, but she said it." "Slow down," I told him. "Who said what, Vanessa?" He said the name, leaving his mouth like poison. "We were arguing about money, about her parents, about everything. She said, you're not my real father." The air between us changed. I put down the shears and stepped closer. "Sit," I said, but he didn't. He just stood there trembling, waiting for me to deny it. I didn't. "Please," he said, his voice cracking, "tell me she's lying." I met his eyes, saw the boy he used to be hiding behind the man who'd forgotten him. "She's not lying," I said quietly. He stared at me as though I'd struck him. "You're serious?" "Yes." His breath came shallow. "So what am I then? A mistake you decided to keep?" "No," I said. "A blessing we chose to love." He shook his head, angry tears welling up. "Why didn't you tell me all these years? You thought it mattered," I said. "It never did." He paced again, his voice rising. "I deserve to know. I spent my life trying to make you proud, and now I don't even know who I am." "You're my son," I said. "That's who you are." "No," he shouted. "You're not even my blood." I took a slow breath and walked to the cabinet where I'd stored Eleanor's papers. The adoption certificate was still there, tucked neatly beside her letter. I handed it to him. "Read it," I said. He took it with shaking hands. His eyes scanned the lines, his name, our signatures, the official seal faded by time. He sank into the nearest chair, the paper trembling. "So it's true," he whispered. "All of it. Every word I said. Eleanor and I adopted you when you were 5. Your birth mother couldn't keep you, and we couldn't imagine life without you. We never told you because love didn't need explanation. You were ours in every way that counted." He looked up, eyes glistening. "Did she love me?" "Really, more than you'll ever understand," I said. "You were her miracle. She used to say you were the only good decision we ever made without thinking twice." He laughed through tears, a raw, broken sound. "And you, did you ever wish you had a real son?" "I had one," I said. "You." He dropped his head into his hands, and for a long time neither of us spoke. The room felt different, heavier, but somehow lighter too. The truth had changed the air. Finally he whispered, "Vanessa knew." "How I imagine her parents had something to do with it," I said. "They like information. It gives them leverage." He wiped his face. "She waited until we fought, until she could use it like a knife. And it cut both of you," I said. "That's what happens when people use truth without love." He looked at me again, quieter now. "I don't know what to do." "You start by remembering who you are," I said. "A man your mother adored. A man I chose to raise. And you don't let anyone make that feel small." He nodded, staring at the document, still shaking in his hands. "I don't even hate you," he said after a moment. "I just hate that she knew before I did." "So do I said. "But this isn't about her. It's about us." He folded the paper carefully as if it might crumble, and handed it back. "Keep it safe," he said. "I don't trust myself to." I took it and placed it back in the cabinet. When I turned, he was looking at Eleanor's photograph. "She looks so calm," he said softly. "She was," I replied. "She believed in peace even when life didn't give her any." "I wish I remembered more about her," he said. "You remember enough," I told him. "The rest is still here. You're proof of her love, Ethan. That's all that matters." He stood then, shoulders straightening, a quiet strength returning to him. "I should go," he said. "Vanessa's probably." He stopped mid-sentence, a flash of realization crossing his face. "No," he said. "Let her wait." He gave me a small, uncertain smile, the first I'd seen in years. "Thanks, Dad." The word landed softly but solidly between us. "Always," I said. When he left, the house was silent again, but it wasn't the lonely kind of silence I'd grown used to. It was full, warm, alive. I walked to the window and watched his car disappear down the street. For the first time in a long while, I felt something shift, a small repair in a bond I thought time had broken beyond mending. They thought that secret would destroy us. It became our armor. After Ethan left that night, I sat in the dark, listening to the soft tick of the old clock above the mantel. It was the same clock Eleanor had chosen years ago, back when time felt like something we owned instead of something that carried us. The hands moved steadily, unbothered by revelation or pain, marking the beginning of a different kind of silence. For years, I had lived quietly because grief demanded it. Now I stayed quiet because it had become my sharpest weapon. The truth about Ethan had set something loose in me, a clarity I hadn't felt since before Eleanor died. I knew what I had to do, and for once I knew I was ready. Within weeks, Morgan Industries began to wobble. It started with whispers, missed projections, delayed shipments, projects quietly shelved. The financial press wrote it off as temporary restructuring. I knew better. I'd studied their ledgers, traced the lines of credit, and recognized the subtle decay that comes when pride outruns balance sheets. Through Eleanor Trust Holdings, I began tightening the strings. Small adjustments first, declining renewals, delaying approvals, shifting minor investments into safer assets. Each move created a ripple imperceptible on its own, but devastating in sequence. Their liquidity dried like water in sun, and they didn't even know who held the heat. It fascinated me watching arrogance eat itself. Morgan Industries had been built on the illusion of control, but illusion is fragile when faith begins to falter. Investors started asking questions. A few sharp analysts noticed discrepancies in internal ownership filings. Somewhere, someone realized that an unnamed trust had quietly acquired influence across multiple divisions. By the time they began searching for the source, it was too late. The machine was already choking on its own gears. I never celebrated it. I simply watched. Every morning I'd make my coffee, sit by the window, and read the market updates on my tablet. The headlines grew more desperate each day. Morgan Industries faces temporary cash flow issues. CEO promises rapid recovery. Silent stakeholder halts dividend payout. That last one made me smile, not because it mentioned me, but because it didn't. I'd made sure of that. Ethan called one afternoon anxious. "Dad, have you seen the news? The company's struggling." "Mister, Morgan says it's just bad press, but I can tell he's worried." "How are you?" I asked. "He's been on edge," Ethan continued, ignoring the question. "He's holding meetings at all hours. Vanessa's mother keeps saying everything's fine, but I've never seen them like this. It's strange." "Strange how?" "They're scared," he said quietly. "But they'll never admit it." "Then let them hide behind their pride," I said. "It's safer than facing the truth." He hesitated. "Dad, you sound like you know something." "I know how men like Richard Morgan think," I said. "They believe pressure builds diamonds, but it also breaks stones." He didn't understand then. He thanked me, promised to call later, and hung up. I looked out at the magnolia tree, its branches bare now, and thought about how nature always takes back what overreaches. You can't cheat growth. You can only borrow it for a time. The Morgans had borrowed everything: money, reputation, trust, and now the bill had come due. I heard about the first real crack a few days later. One of their key creditors froze an extension, citing structural uncertainty. Their stock dropped 5% overnight. The next morning it dropped 10, then 20. The board convened an emergency session. I didn't need to be there to know how it went. I'd been in those rooms before, long ago, when Eleanor was still alive. The same panic disguised as professionalism, the same trembling hands pretending confidence. I pictured Richard Morgan standing at the head of the table, his voice calm, his suit pressed, his mind already clawing for someone to blame. Men like him never faced their failures directly. They found scapegoats to hang them on. And when they ran out of enemies, they turned on family. By the second week, rumors began swirling through financial circles. "Someone's pulling strings behind the scenes," an analyst said on a morning talk show. "There's a silent investor moving against them." The words "silent investor" echoed in my head like a melody. I didn't have to speak a word. My presence was already rewriting their story. From my modest home, I watched the footage of Richard Morgan leaving his office surrounded by reporters. He smiled, of course, that rehearsed, confident grin that men like him learned in mirrors. "Our fundamentals are strong," he told them. "We're simply restructuring for efficiency." Behind him, Vanessa stood stiff and expressionless, her designer coat framing a woman who finally looked small. I turned off the television. I didn't need to see the end of that interview to know it would play out the same way all prideful stories do. First denial, then confusion, then the quiet realization that no one is coming to save you. The next day, an old colleague of mine, one who'd retired from the same financial circles I once navigated, called me unexpectedly. "Bennett," he said, his voice low, "you hearing what's happening to the Morgans, just what the news says," I replied. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about this silent investor rumor, would you?" "I wouldn't," I said, "but I admire their timing." He chuckled. "Rumor says it's personal. Someone with a grudge. Aren't all investments personal in the end?" I asked. We talked a few more minutes before hanging up. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, the late afternoon sun spilling across the room. I could almost feel Eleanor in that light, steady, patient, proud. She would have told me not to gloat, not to harden. But this wasn't vengeance. It was balance. I hadn't lied, cheated, or stolen. I'd simply moved the truth into the right hands. Somewhere across town, the Morgans were panicking, restructuring loans, begging for backing, calling in favors that would go unanswered. I didn't need to see them to know. Pride has a sound when it breaks. It's soft, almost polite, like glass cracking under silk. Their empire began to crumble, and I hadn't even touched it. When the Morgans announced their charity gala, it made the front page of every local business column. The headline called it a celebration of resilience, but I knew what it really was, a performance of survival. The venue was the Belridge Hotel downtown, the same marble and crystal palace that had hosted political fundraisers and royal receptions. They wanted spectacle, a reminder to the city that the Morgans were untouchable. I suspected they also wanted reassurance for themselves. Desperation always hides behind chandeliers. I received an invitation by courier 2 days before the event. The envelope was thick, embossed, and smelled faintly of perfume. My name was written in Vanessa's looping script. "Dear Charles," it read, "we'd be honored if you joined us. The evening will be special, a chance for the family to stand together." I smiled when I read family. They had no idea how close they were to the truth. I decided to attend. Revenge, like finance, was best executed in public, under the illusion of civility. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully, black suit, dark tie, Eleanor's silver cufflinks polished until they caught the light. The air outside was cold enough to bite, but inside the hotel, the heat was suffocating. Chandeliers hung like constellations above a sea of sequins and champagne. The Morgans had spared no expense. A string quartet played near the staircase, and photographers circled like bees around a hive of vanity. I found a place near the back of the ballroom, invisible among the donors and board members. On stage, Richard Morgan stood at the podium, his wife radiant beside him, Vanessa a perfect reflection of their poise. Ethan hovered behind her, smiling tightly, his eyes darting around the crowd. Tonight, Richard began, "We gather not just to celebrate success, but to remind ourselves what true leadership looks like: commitment, perseverance, and generosity." His voice carried the confidence of a man used to applause. The audience clapped on cue. I watched Vanessa beam with pride, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm. He didn't flinch, but he didn't look at her either. The tension in his jaw told me everything. He'd been avoiding my calls since our talk about his adoption. I didn't blame him. Some truths needed time to settle before they could heal. The speeches continued, all polished sincerity and hollow gratitude. Waiters glided between tables, refilling glasses, exchanging polite smiles for generous tips. Every few minutes, Richard mentioned our company as though Morgan Industries still carried the weight it once had. But the crowd wasn't convinced. I could see it in their eyes, the unease, the polite curiosity. Everyone there had read the news. Everyone knew the empire was faltering. They were here to see whether the king could still stand upright. Near the end of the evening, Richard raised his hand for silence. "Before we close, I want to thank our sponsors," he said, turning to gesture toward the massive LED screen behind him. "Without their partnership, none of this would be possible." The lights dimmed. Music swelled. The screen flickered to life, displaying the logos of familiar corporations, real estate firms, law practices, banks. The audience applauded politely as each appeared. Then came the last one. The logo bloomed across the screen, clean white serif letters on a dark blue field, Eleanor Trust Holdings. The room changed in an instant. A murmur spread through the crowd like a current of electricity. People turned to one another, whispering, confused. The Morgans froze. "Mrs." Morgan's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around her champagne flute. Vanessa's complexion drained to ash. Richard blinked twice, then forced a laugh into the microphone. "Ah, yes, our new partner. We're honored to have them join our family of investors." He glanced at Vanessa, who looked as if she might faint. Ethan stood completely still, staring at the logo, his expression unreadable. The whispers grew louder. A woman at the next table asked, "Isn't that the trust that's been buying up their stock?" Another replied, "I thought it was hostile." "No one knows who runs it," said a third. I stepped forward before the murmurs could become noise. The crowd parted slightly as I moved toward the stage. Richard saw me, then his smile freezing halfway through. "Charles," he said into the microphone, his voice catching. "What a surprise. I didn't know you'd made it." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. I reached the edge of the stage, the spotlight brushing my shoulder. "Beautiful event." He nodded stiffly. "We do our best." "Indeed," I said. "True wealth doesn't need applause." For a moment no one breathed. The phrase hung there light but heavy, cutting through the perfume and pretense. Someone near the back laughed nervously. Cameras flashed. Vanessa took a step toward me, her mouth opening but no sound came out. Ethan looked from her to me, realization dawning in his eyes. The logo behind them glowed brighter, casting Eleanor's name over all three of them. It felt like justice. Not loud or dramatic, just clean, precise, undeniable. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's continue the evening," he said. But the audience was no longer listening. The illusion had cracked. People began drifting toward the exits, whispering to one another, phones lighting up as news spread faster than champagne could refill. I turned to leave. As I passed Ethan, he touched my arm lightly. "It's you," he whispered. "You're behind it." I looked at him and said softly, "You already know why." He said nothing, but his eyes filled with shock, pride, and something like love told me enough. Outside, the night air was cold and clean. The sounds of laughter and clinking glasses faded behind me. I walked toward the parking lot, past the glittering cars and the valets who had no idea they'd just witnessed the first tremor of an earthquake. I paused once to look back at the hotel, where Eleanor's name still shone across the giant screen. For 15 years, they had erased her. Tonight she stood higher than all of them. I started my car, the engine humming softly beneath the quiet hum of the city, and pulled into the darkness. But humiliation was only the appetizer. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks of the gala, Morgan Industries imploded. Stockholders fled like birds before a storm. Banks withdrew lines of credit, and partners who had once toasted the Morgan's genius now avoided their calls. The company that had once defined success in this city was bleeding from every account. Every morning the news carried another headline. Morgan Industries under investigation, lawsuits filed over misrepresented earnings, CEO denies fraud allegations. I didn't need to read the details. I already knew the truth. Their downfall wasn't sabotage. It was gravity. They'd built their empire too high on arrogance and too thin on integrity. My role had only been to remove the scaffolding and let nature do the rest. Ethan called once during that time, his voice shaken. "Dad, they're saying people might go to prison. It's bad." I didn't know it was this bad. "You couldn't have," I said gently. "Men like Richard Morgan never show the cracks until they're standing in the rubble." "Vanessa's a mess," he said. "Her parents barely speak. They're fighting over everything, money, blame, lawyers. She keeps saying it's all your fault. Mine, because you embarrassed them at the gala. She said you humiliated her family." "If her family's reputation was that fragile, it was already broken," I said. "You should stay clear of them, son. This will get uglier before it ends." He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "You planned this, didn't you?" "No," I said. "I just stopped pretending they were untouchable." After we hung up, I sat by the window watching the late afternoon light fade across the magnolia tree. The branches were bare again, stripped by winter winds. There was peace in that kind of emptiness, a reminder that destruction was sometimes necessary for renewal. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. I thought that was the end of it. Then one morning, as I sorted through emails, a message appeared from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was a single word: justice. I opened it. The body of the email contained only 5 words. They deserved this R. No signature, no attachments, no traceable details. Just the letter R. I stared at it, my pulse tightening. I received dozens of emails every week. Old clients, financial updates, spam, but this one felt different. Whoever wrote it knew me, or at least knew enough to reach me at an address that wasn't public. I read it again, then again, hearing Eleanor's voice in the back of my mind. "Be careful who shares your silence," she'd once told me. The letter R hung in my thoughts like a hook. And then I remembered. The photograph in the Morgan's dining room, the group portrait from Morgan Industries, the one with Eleanor standing beside a young woman named Rebecca Lang. She'd had bright eyes, the kind that noticed everything. The same photo had been in Eleanor's wallet years ago. At the time, I hadn't understood why. Now I wondered if I was beginning to. I searched my files, pulled up every digital image I'd taken from Eleanor's things. The picture was there, slightly faded but clear enough. Rebecca Lang. I typed her name into a search engine and waited. Hundreds of results appeared: conference rosters, charity fundraisers, corporate filings. Most were dead ends. Then one caught my eye, a decade-old article titled, "Whistleblower Leaves Morgan Industries Amid Accounting Scandal." The story was short, buried in the archives of a local financial paper. It described an employee, unnamed by request, who had come forward about internal irregularities years before the company faced public scrutiny. The timeline fit. The scandal had begun around the same time Eleanor resigned. I read further, tracing references and footnotes until one line made me sit up. According to internal sources, a junior accountant named Rebecca Lang provided documentation but was overruled by senior management. My hands froze on the keyboard. Rebecca had tried to expose them. She'd worked beside Eleanor. Maybe she'd even warned her. And now someone with that same name, someone signing only as R, was reaching out to me. I looked at the clock. It was after midnight, but sleep was far away. I opened a private database subscription, one I used for old consulting clients, and ran a background check. It took several minutes, but the result confirmed it. Rebecca Lang, 41, formerly employed at Morgan Industries, currently listed as an independent financial consultant. Last known address, the west side of the city. I leaned back in my chair, letting the realization sink in. It wasn't coincidence. The email wasn't random. This woman, whoever she truly was, had ties to my wife's past and to the company that had destroyed her. Perhaps she'd been waiting for the same thing I had, for the truth to come full circle. Outside, the city lights blinked against the dark, distant and indifferent. I closed my laptop and sat still for a long time. For the first time since Eleanor's death, I felt as if I wasn't fighting alone. Someone else had seen what happened back then. Someone else had carried the same wound. I thought again of the words in the email. They deserved this. There was anger in them, yes, but something else too: recognition. A shared understanding between two people shaped by the same betrayal. I poured myself a drink, the ice clicking softly in the glass, and went to the window. The magnolia branches trembled under the wind, skeletal and strong. Eleanor used to say that justice wasn't about punishment, it was about truth finding its way home. Maybe she'd been right all along. Maybe this was her way of showing me where to look next. I turned back to my desk and reopened the photograph, zooming in on Eleanor's face beside Rebecca's. They were both smiling, unaware of what the future would cost them. "Who are you, Rebecca?" I whispered. The screen glowed in the dark, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat beside her name. I knew then that I would find her, whatever it took. Eleanor's shadow was leading me somewhere back to her. I found Rebecca 3 days after the email. Her office was in a quiet building on the west side of the city, the kind of place where time moved slowly and secrets stayed folded between files. When I called to ask for an appointment, she hesitated before answering. "Charles Bennett," she repeated, her voice soft, cautious. "I wasn't sure you'd call." "You sent the message?" I asked. "Yes," she said simply. "Then I think we have a lot to talk about." The next morning I drove there early. The hallway outside her office smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and the light through the windows carried that pale, forgiving glow that winter mornings sometimes have. When I knocked, she opened the door herself. For a moment I couldn't speak. She looked to be in her early 40s, tall, poised with the kind of grace that isn't learned but inherited. Her eyes stopped me cold. They were Eleanor's eyes. Not just the color, but the warmth, the quiet intelligence, the way they searched a person as if reading a page no one else could see. She studied me too, and something flickered behind her composure, a mix of recognition and pain. "You look like her," I said before I could stop myself. "So do you," she replied. Her office was modest, lined with files, framed certificates, and one photograph on the desk, a younger Rebecca standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. Perhaps a foster parent. I sat across from her, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, like the pause before truth arrives. "You worked with my wife," I began. "At Morgan Industries." She nodded. "Yes. She trained me when I was just starting. She was brilliant, patient. I don't think I'd have lasted there without her." "You sent me that email," I said. "Why?" "Because I've been waiting," she said quietly. For years. Waiting for someone else to see what they did to her. Waiting for someone who cared enough to finish what she started. You mean the investigation? She shook her head. No. I mean justice. Her words carried a conviction that felt familiar. I leaned forward. You said they deserved it. What did you mean? She took a deep breath. She didn't tell you, did she? About me. My pulse slowed, then quickened again. About you. She looked down at her hands, then back at me. I'm her daughter, Mr. Bennett. Eleanor's daughter. The room went silent except for the faint hum of the radiator. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. That's not possible, I said, but even as I said it, I knew it was. I could see Eleanor in the shape of her face, the tilt of her smile, the calm defiance in her posture. She never told me. Rebecca nodded sadly. She couldn't. She was young when I was born. 17. Her parents were strict, the kind who thought shame was a bigger sin than cruelty. They forced her to give me up for adoption before she met you. She told me all of this much later, too late. I felt the air thicken in my lungs. You met her, once she said. Briefly. I found her through an old employment record. I'd spent years searching, and when I finally saw her, she was standing outside Morgan Industries. She looked tired, but she smiled when she saw me. She said she'd been waiting for me too. Rebecca's voice trembled now, and I saw her swallow hard before continuing. We sat in her car for an hour just talking. She told me everything, how she'd built a life, how she'd married you, how she'd adopted Ethan. She said she never stopped thinking about me. She gave me a letter that night. I wasn't allowed to open it until after she died. My eyes burned. She never mentioned you, I whispered. Not once. But she left something in her safe, a resignation letter and a note that sounded like a farewell. I thought it was just about the Morgans. Rebecca nodded. It was about everything. She carried too much guilt, too many secrets. She thought she could protect everyone if she sacrificed herself. She couldn't bear to tell you because she thought you'd see her differently. Never, I said. I could never have loved her less for it. Rebecca smiled faintly. That's what she said you'd say. She stood and walked to a small cabinet by the window. From it she pulled a folded envelope, edges soft from age. This is the letter she gave me, she said. I think you should read it. I opened it carefully. Eleanor's handwriting filled the page in graceful loops, steady and unhurried. My dearest Rebecca, it began. I don't know if time will ever forgive me for the choices I made, but I hope someday you will. I gave you up to protect you from the world that shaped me, but I have never gone a day without loving you. If you ever find your way back to me, tell your brother and father that you are the missing piece I always dreamed of seeing again. The words blurred as my eyes filled. I could almost hear her voice speaking them, soft but firm, filled with that same unbreakable gentleness she carried even in her hardest days. I folded the letter back along its creases and handed it to Rebecca. She called you her daughter, I said. She called me her husband. That makes us family. Rebecca's breath caught, and for a moment her composure broke. She reached across the desk and took my hand. I've wanted to hear that my whole life, she said. We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. The past stretched between us like a river finally finding its course. I thought of Eleanor alone in her last months, writing letters to 2 children, one she raised, one she lost, and how even in her pain she had built the bridge we were now crossing. Do you still want justice? I asked finally. Rebecca nodded. Yes, but not the kind that destroys, the kind that reveals. Then we'll finish this together, I said. For her. She squeezed my hand once before letting go. The sun had begun to sink outside, throwing a golden haze across the office. In that light, she looked so much like Eleanor that I had to look away to steady myself. When I did, I caught my reflection in the window, an old man who had finally found what he didn't know he'd lost. She'd be proud of you, I said quietly. Of us both. Rebecca smiled through tears. She already knows, she said. She's the reason we found each other. I stood uncertain how to say goodbye, and she stepped forward and embraced me. It wasn't a polite gesture or the awkward hug of strangers. It was something older, stronger, the joining of 2 lives that had been meant to meet long before. I closed my eyes, letting the grief and the comfort blend into something whole. For the first time in years, I didn't feel hollow. I felt home. When we finally stepped apart, the sun had vanished behind the buildings, leaving only the soft reflection of the 2 of us in the glass. I looked at her one last time and whispered, "Thank you." She shook her head. "Don't thank me. Thank her." I nodded because she was right. Eleanor had always been the one who brought light to dark places, even after she was gone. As I walked out into the cooling evening, I felt the city around me fade into quiet. Somewhere beyond the noise and the memory, I could almost hear her voice, steady, loving, triumphant. Eleanor had reunited her family even from beyond. The weeks after meeting Rebecca passed in a kind of quiet equilibrium. For the first time in years, my days felt anchored to something meaningful rather than merely endured. Ethan and I had begun speaking more often, careful but steady, like two men relearning trust. Rebecca and I met every few days, piecing together fragments of Eleanor's life, letters, photos, old notebooks. It was healing in a way I hadn't expected. But peace never lasts long when pride is wounded, and Vanessa Morgan's pride had been left bleeding since the night of the gala. I should have expected her to reach out, but when she called, her voice still caught me off guard. "Charles," she said, sounding almost gentle, "I owe you an apology. For everything. You were right about my parents, about the company. I didn't want to believe it then, but I see it now. Could we talk? Privately?" Her tone was disarming, controlled, sincere, but too practiced. Years of deception had taught me that truth rarely sounds rehearsed. Where I asked. "Our house," she said quickly. "Ethan's out of town on business. I just want to make things right. For him, if not for us." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it. But another part, the one that had seen too many corners of human weakness, knew that closure has to be faced, not avoided. "All right," I said. "Tomorrow night." "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll cook." The line went silent, but something in her tone lingered long after I hung up, a note too sweet to be genuine. The next evening I drove across town under a heavy sky. Her house looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of its former grandeur. A "for sale" sign leaned crookedly in the front yard. I parked and stood for a moment before walking up the path, listening to the faint hum of music inside. When she opened the door, I almost didn't recognize her. The glamorous sheen she wore like armor was gone. Her face was pale drawn, her lipstick too bright against tired eyes. "Charles," she said, forcing a smile. "You came." "You asked," I replied. She led me inside. The dining room was set for 2 candles, lit plates, arranged a bottle of red breathing on the table. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and something else, chemical metallic. "I made osso buco," she said, smoothing her hair. "Ethan's favorite. I thought it might make you feel at home." "I appreciate the gesture," I said, taking a seat. She poured the wine, her hands steady, her eyes never leaving mine. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she said. "How everything went wrong. You must hate me." "No," I said. "Hate's a luxury I can't afford." She gave a brittle laugh. "You're still so calm. Always in control." "Calm isn't control," I said. "It's survival." She filled my glass first, then hers. "Then let's survive the night together." Her hand lingered on the stem of the glass as she slid it toward me. I didn't move. Instead, I watched her face. Her eyes flickered just for a second when she thought I wasn't looking. It was small, too small for most to catch, but I'd spent a lifetime studying micro-reactions. Fear, calculation, anticipation. I lifted the glass, swirling the wine gently under my nose. It was rich and dark, but beneath the scent of oak and spice was something faintly bitter, an aftertaste that didn't belong. My stomach turned cold. I set the glass down. "You used too much," I said. Her hand froze amid motion. "What the pills?" I said. Crushed into the wine. "The bitterness gives it away." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. "I've known this scent before," I continued quietly. "Eleanor's pills had the same smell. You must have read that somewhere. Her death report, maybe." Her eyes widened, and for the first time I saw the panic behind the mask. "You think I don't think," I said. "I know." She stepped back, shaking her head. "You've ruined my life, Charles. You took everything from us, my family, my reputation. Do you know what it's like to lose everything because of a man like you?" "Eleanor did," I said. "She lost her name, her career, her peace. You and your family made sure of that." "She was weak," Vanessa spat. "She let them use her. She could have fought back." "She did," I said. "Through me." Her breath came fast now. You don't understand. They'll come for me next. The investors, the board. My parents are finished and I'm next. I can't start over. Not after all this. So you thought you'd erase the problem, I said softly. End me like they ended her. Her face crumpled. It was supposed to be painless. Just sleep. And then what I asked. You'd tell Ethan it was my heart. Maybe you'd get sympathy, maybe forgiveness. She sank into the chair opposite me, trembling. I didn't want to. I thought it would make it stop. I reached into my coat pocket and placed my phone on the table. The screen glowed faintly red, recording. You should know, I said. I've been recording since I walked in. Her head snapped up. I'm old, I said. Not stupid. She looked at the phone, realization dawning. She lunged across the table, knocking over the wine bottle, red, spilling like blood across the linen. Delete it, she screamed. You can't do this to me. I didn't move. I watched her panic spiral, watched the last mask fall. The doorbell rang, then sharp and sudden. She froze. The sound came again, followed by a firm voice outside. Mrs. Morgan, this is the police. We have a warrant to speak with you. Her face drained of color. You called them, she whispered. I didn't have to, I said. They've been watching you since the gala. She sank back into her chair, sobbing quietly as the knocking grew louder. I picked up the phone, stopped the recording, and slipped it back into my pocket. You could have been better than them, I said softly. You had the chance. She didn't answer. When I opened the door, 2 officers stepped inside, nodding politely before walking past me. I didn't stay to watch. Outside, the night air felt clean, almost sharp. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the stars, barely visible through the haze. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. There was no victory in what had just happened, only inevitability. Some people build their lives on deceit so long they forget what truth smells like until it kills them. I started the car, driving slowly down the street, the flashing lights fading in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted by Eleanor's memory. Tonight I understood her better than ever. She had faced betrayal quietly with grace. I'd simply done the same, only louder. She tried to poison me, but only revealed who she really was. The night after Vanessa's arrest, the city felt unnaturally still. News of her attempted poisoning spread quickly, whispered through corporate circles that thrived on other people's humiliation. Morgan Industries was gone, their fortune frozen under investigation, their reputation rotting in the headlines. Yet even with the empire crumbling, I didn't feel finished. There was one truth still buried, and I had carried it long enough. I wanted them to face what they had done to Eleanor, not as a rumor, not as a memory, but as a reckoning. So I arranged one last dinner. The setting, poetic in its cruelty, was the Morgans' own foreclosed mansion. The bank had taken it weeks earlier, but I leased the space for a single night through one of my shell firms. The irony wasn't lost on me. The house they once flaunted as proof of their power now stood empty, its marble floors echoing with nothing but ghosts. I arrived early, overseeing the setup myself. The dining table gleamed under candlelight, each place setting polished and perfect. Across from my seat, 3 chairs waited, Ethan's, Rebecca's, and the Morgans. I didn't invite them through lawyers or mediators. I sent hand-delivered notes, written in my own hand. One final dinner, I wrote. You owe her that much. To my surprise, they all came. Richard and his wife entered first, older than I remembered, faces drawn and stiff. They looked around the room as though walking through a mausoleum. Ethan arrived next, cautious but resolute, Rebecca beside him. The siblings stood close, silent but steady. When everyone was seated, I poured the wine myself. It's strange, I began, how this table always looked more like a courtroom than a place for meals. Richard's wife gave a cold smile. If this is about Vanessa, it's not, I said. This is about Eleanor. The name landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Richard shifted uncomfortably. We've paid for our mistakes, Bennett, he said. There's nothing left to discuss. That's where you're wrong, I replied. I reached into the briefcase beside my chair and pulled out a folder thick with documents. I spread them across the table, one by one. Financial statements, internal memos, legal correspondence. Do these look familiar? He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the papers. I saw the moment recognition hit him. Where did you get these? From the company archives, I said. The ones you tried to bury when you forced Eleanor to take the fall. Fraudulent transfers, falsified ledgers, forged approvals, all signed under her name. His wife's face went pale. "You can't prove I don't need to," I said, sliding another page toward her. "You already did." It was a photocopy of a letter Eleanor had written the day she resigned, the one she never sent. "Read it," I said. Aloud. She hesitated, then began in a trembling voice. "To whom it may concern, I am leaving Morgan Industries because I can no longer bear to be part of something dishonest. I am taking responsibility not because I am guilty, but because I have lost faith that truth will protect me." She stopped, her voice cracking. "That's enough," Richard said. "No," I said quietly. "Not yet." I pulled one final envelope from the case, the letter Eleanor had left for me, the one I'd hidden for years. "You all told the world she died of illness," I said. "But she didn't. She died because you stripped her of her dignity." I opened the envelope and laid the pages flat on the table. This was her farewell, her handwriting, her truth. The room fell silent. I read aloud. "I thought I could live with their lies, but I can't. They took my name, my work, my peace. Tell Charles and Ethan I love them. Tell them I just wanted to stop being afraid." When I finished, even the air seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stared at the letter, his jaw clenched, tears threatening, but refused. "She didn't die of illness," I said. "She died of your shame." Richard slammed his fist on the table. "You think this changes anything? You can't bring her back." "No," I said. "But I can make sure she's never erased again." At that moment, two uniformed officers entered through the open doors. One of them nodded to me, then turned to the Morgans. "Richard Morgan, Elaine Morgan," the officer said formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate fraud and obstruction of justice." Richard stood, his face purple. "This is absurd," he shouted. "You orchestrated this." "No," I said. "You did 15 years ago." The officers began reading their rights as they protested, their voices breaking against the inevitability of it all. Rebecca stepped forward, then her voice calm but strong. "I worked under Eleanor," she said. "She protected me even when I tried to expose you. I'll testify." Richard froze at her words, confusion crossing his face. "Who are you?" She met his eyes steadily. "Her daughter." He blinked, the truth landing too slowly to matter. The officers led them toward the door. As they passed, Richard turned to me. "You think this makes you a hero?" "No," I said. "Just honest." The door closed behind them, and the house went quiet. The candles flickered in the sudden draft, their flames bending but not breaking. Ethan looked at me, his eyes wet. "You carried this all these years," he said. "Why now?" "Because I was waiting for you to see her," I said. "Not as a mother, but as a person who deserved better." Rebecca reached across the table and took my hand. "You gave her that," she said softly. "You gave her peace." I shook my head. "She gave it to us." The three of us sat there for a while, listening to the echo of footsteps fading down the hall. I looked around the grand room one last time, the same marble floors, the same high ceilings, but the weight of it was gone. The house no longer belonged to the Morgans. It belonged to the truth. Ethan raised his glass of untouched wine. "To her," he said. "To Eleanor." We drank in silence. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, fading as they carried the last remnants of deceit away. I stood, buttoning my coat, and glanced at the letter still lying open on the table. Her words caught the candlelight, glowing softly like something sacred. "She never wanted revenge," I said quietly. "Just justice." Rebecca nodded. "And you gave it to her." I walked to the doorway, turning back one last time. "No," I said. "Justice gave it to her. I was just the messenger." As we stepped out into the night, the wind moved through the empty hallways, whispering against the marble like a sigh of release. The house that had once echoed with arrogance now stood hollow, cleansed. Somewhere in that stillness, I could almost hear her laugh again, gentle and free. Revenge wasn't the end, it was only justice catching up. The weeks after the arrests felt oddly quiet, like the air after a storm when everything is too still to trust. The headlines screamed for days, feeding on the Morgans' downfall, fraud, corruption, betrayal. But for me, the noise faded quickly. I didn't need the world to witness justice. I had already seen it with my own eyes that night in the mansion. Still, the echoes of what had been done lingered in strange ways. Richard Morgan was sent to a state psychiatric hospital after his first court appearance. The papers said it was exhaustion and temporary psychosis. I called it consequence. When arrogance collapses, it doesn't fall gently. It drags the mind down with it. I didn't intend to see him again, but fate, or something close to it, decided otherwise. One morning, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was faint, ragged, and shaking. "Charles," it said, barely more than a whisper. "It's Richard." For a moment, I thought it was a mistake, some cruel impersonation. Then I heard the rasp in his breath, the same tremor I'd heard in the courtroom when he realized the evidence was real. "I need to ask you something," he said. "She's here. In my room. Every night." My hand tightened on the phone. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. "Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking. "She stands at the end of my bed looking at me. I tell her I'm sorry, but she doesn't speak. She just watches." I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us, fragile as glass. Finally, I said, "Maybe she's not here to haunt you, Richard. Maybe she's here to remind you." "Remind me of what? That guilt is just love without a home," I said. "You built yours on her pain. Now it's time to face it." He began to cry softly, the sound small and human. "Tell her I'm sorry," he said. "Please. Tell her I didn't mean." "You meant every word back then," I interrupted gently. "But remorse doesn't vanish because it's late. I'll tell her." When the call ended, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the framed photo of Eleanor. Her smile hadn't faded with the years, but there was something new in how I saw it, something forgiving, almost knowing. Maybe forgiveness had always been there waiting for me to understand it. The next day, I drove to the hospital. It was an old building on the outskirts of the city, gray stone softened by vines and time. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and silence. A nurse guided me down a corridor lined with locked doors. When we reached his room, she said quietly, "He has good days and bad. Today seems like both." I nodded and stepped inside. Richard Morgan sat by the window, thin and pale, staring out at the courtyard where the wind pushed dead leaves in circles. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and for the first time in decades there was no superiority in his eyes, only exhaustion. "You came," he said. "You didn't have to. Neither did you 15 years ago," I said. "But here we are." He laughed softly, a broken sound. "They tell me I'll get better," he said, "but I don't want to. Every time I close my eyes, I see her. She doesn't speak. She just stands there in the light." "Maybe that's not punishment," I said. "Maybe that's mercy." He looked up sharply. "Mercy? She doesn't want you dead, Richard," I said. "She wants you to live with the truth. That's harder." I reached into my coat and pulled out a small photograph, the one I'd taken from our bedroom, the one where Eleanor was laughing, her hair caught in the wind. I placed it on the windowsill. "Keep that," I said. "Look at it when you think she's standing there. Maybe one day you'll realize she isn't angry anymore." His eyes filled, but he didn't speak. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, he said quietly, "You're a better man than I thought." I paused. "No," I said. "I'm just a man who learned too late what forgiveness costs." Outside, the sky was heavy with rain. I stood beneath the awning for a moment, listening to it start to fall slow and cold. It felt cleansing somehow. I drove home in silence, the road slick beneath the tires, my thoughts as unsettled as the weather. That evening, Ethan came by. He looked different, tired but clearer, as if something heavy had finally been put down. "It's done," he said, handing me a folder of signed documents. "The divorce. Official." I nodded. "How do you feel?" "Free," he said. "And ashamed it took this long." "Don't be," I said. "Freedom always costs something. You just paid late." He smiled faintly, then looked around the house. "It feels different here," he said. "Lighter." "It should," I said. "This place was built on love, not fear. It remembers." He sat down, glancing at the old photograph of Eleanor on the mantel. "Rebecca and I have been talking," he said, "about the foundation. We want to expand it. Help families like ours, people who lost everything because someone powerful decided they could." I studied him quietly, pride swelling in my chest. "Your mother would have liked that. Then let's make her proud," he said. "You'll help us. I'll guide you," I said. "But it's yours now." He nodded, his jaw steady. "Rebecca's already drafting proposals. She's brilliant. She gets that from her mother," I said. We both laughed, soft but genuine. For the first time in years, the sound filled the house instead of echoing in it. When he left, I walked outside onto the porch. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and clean. Somewhere across town, Richard Morgan would be sitting by his window, staring at the photo of the woman he destroyed and the man she left behind to finish her story. I didn't wish him pain. I wished him clarity. Sometimes that's worse, but it's also more honest. I looked up at the stars, faint but steady, and thought about Eleanor, how her grace had outlasted every cruelty. It had taken me half a lifetime to understand her greatest lesson. Forgiveness wasn't surrender, it was release. It didn't excuse what was done, it unshackled what was left. Forgiveness is sharper than any blade, it cuts the chains of hate. The morning the lawyer called the sky was the same muted gray as the day Eleanor died. I took it as a kind of symmetry, not a sadness. He asked me to come by the office with Ethan and Rebecca to finalize the trust arrangements. I knew what it was about, though I hadn't told them yet. The foundation was thriving, its reputation restored after years of silence. We'd rebuilt it from the ashes of deceit into something honest, something that reflected who Eleanor was. Still, the final piece of her legacy remained sealed, her will. When we arrived, the air inside the firm was thick with that blend of old leather and ink that always made me feel like I'd stepped back into a different era. The lawyer, Tom Jenkins, stood as we entered. He looked older than I remembered, his hair almost white now, but his smile was steady. "Charles," he said warmly, "it's been a long road." "It has," I replied. "Let's finish it." Ethan and Rebecca sat side by side at the long oak table, their reflections mirrored in the polished surface. For a moment I saw Eleanor there too, sitting between them, her presence quiet but undeniable. Tom adjusted his glasses and opened a folder. "This," he said, "is the last directive from Eleanor Bennett, written and notarized shortly before her death. She entrusted it to me with instructions not to reveal its contents until certain legal conditions were met, the formation of the Eleanor Foundation being one of them." He glanced at me. "You met that condition years ago, Charles, though I think she always knew you'd wait until the right time." I nodded. She was right. He unfolded the document carefully, his voice low but clear as he began to read. "I, Eleanor Grace Bennett, being of sound mind and memory, leave the following wishes and possessions to those I love. To my husband Charles I, leave my gratitude and the peace he gave me when the world offered none. To our son Ethan I leave my faith. I know he will find his way, even if he loses it for a time. And to my firstborn Rebecca I leave my forgiveness for the years we never had, but the love we found all the same. Finally, to them both I leave the Eleanor Foundation to guide it together as brother and sister, not bound by blood but by purpose." Ethan's hand tightened slightly around Rebecca's. Tom continued, "There is also a letter addressed to you, Charles." She asked that I read it aloud. He pulled out an envelope yellowed with age and broke the seal. "My dearest Charles," he began, "if our son loses his way, give him a chance to return. You always believed in second chances. That's what I loved most about you. I know how heavy silence can be, but someday it will lift, and when it does, I hope you'll forgive yourself for surviving me. Build something good out of what was broken, not to replace me, but to remember who we were when we still believed in kindness." His voice faltered slightly before continuing. "And when the time comes, plant a magnolia tree. It was the first thing we planted together, and it will bloom again long after we're both gone. That will be enough for me." He folded the letter and handed it to me. My throat ached, but I kept my composure. "She always loved magnolias," I said softly. "She said they were proof that beauty could return after winter." Rebecca reached across the table and touched my arm. "She was right," she said. Ethan leaned forward, his voice quiet. "She left all this for us to lead together." "Yes," I said. "She believed in balance. She wanted you both to heal what she couldn't." "And you?" Ethan asked. "What about you?" "My part's done," I said. "I built the frame. It's time for you to fill it." Tom smiled faintly. "That's not entirely true. She left you something else." He handed me a small box wrapped in faded ribbon. I opened it slowly. Inside was Eleanor's wedding ring, still shining, though time had dulled its edges. Beneath it was a folded note in her handwriting. "When you wear this again, smile. It means you kept your promise." I slipped the ring into my pocket, not because I intended to wear it, but because it felt right to carry her with me one last time. The meeting ended quietly. Tom shook my hand, his eyes kind. "She would be proud of all three of you," he said. Outside, the day had turned brighter, the clouds thinning enough to let sunlight spill across the steps. Ethan turned to me. "We're going to do this right, Dad." No shortcuts, no compromises. That's the only way it'll last, I said. Remember that. He nodded. Will you stay involved? From the background, I said. I'll always be here, just not in the way you think. Rebecca smiled. That sounds like something she would have said. Maybe she's finally rubbed off on me, I said. We spent that afternoon at the Foundation's new headquarters, a renovated brick building filled with light and life. Staff moved with purpose, clients came and went, and for once the place felt more like hope than business. Ethan introduced me to the new team, Rebecca, to the board. They had turned what started as an act of restitution into something living. Watching them, I realized that this quiet forward motion was what Eleanor had always wanted. She didn't need revenge. She wanted renewal. A week later, the three of us visited her grave. It was on a hill just outside the city beneath a canopy of old trees. We brought a young magnolia sapling its roots, wrapped in burlap, the same kind Eleanor and I had planted behind our first home. Together, we dug a small hole beside her headstone. The earth was soft, still damp from the previous night's rain. When we set the tree in place, Rebecca knelt, pressing her hands gently into the soil. For her, she said. For all of us, Ethan added. I stood beside them, the wind tugging at my coat, and thought of all the versions of Eleanor I had known, the young woman laughing in the summer sun, the mother singing quietly while she cooked, the professional whose name was dragged through lies but whose dignity never cracked. When the tree was steady, I took the ring from my pocket and buried it just beneath the roots. Now she'll always be part of what grows, I said. Rebecca wiped her eyes. You really loved her, she whispered. Always, I said. We stood there for a long while as the wind settled into stillness. The magnolia's small leaves quivered, catching light like tiny mirrors. It would be years before it flowered fully, but I knew when it did, the blossoms would look exactly like the ones she used to cut and place in a vase on our kitchen table. When we finally walked back toward the car, Ethan lingered behind, turning once more to look at the tree. You think she can see us? He asked. I think she's been watching all along, I said. He nodded, smiling faintly. Then we'd better make her proud. You already have, I said. That evening I sat alone in the house she and I had built, the air filled with that faint scent of magnolia drifting in through the open window. For the first time in years, there was no heaviness, no waiting for the next wound to heal. Just peace. The papers on my desk were gone, the ledgers closed, the plans finished. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow across the porch where Eleanor once stood to call me in for dinner. I poured a glass of wine not for victory but for closure, and lifted it toward her photograph. You were right, I said. Forgiveness was the only ending worth fighting for. The house creaked gently as if answering. I smiled. That night, the poor, naive father finally rested rich in every way that mattered. Every story begins with pride, and ends, if we're lucky, with understanding. Charles's journey wasn't about vengeance in the end. It was about restoration. He learned that silence could be more powerful than rage, and that love, when tested by betrayal, can either harden or heal. Through loss, deceit, and time, he discovered that dignity isn't something others give you, it's what you protect, even when no one believes you deserve it. Eleanor's legacy didn't live in her name, but in the people who carried her truth forward. Ethan's redemption and Rebecca's return weren't miracles. They were the quiet proof that forgiveness doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. The magnolia they planted wasn't just a symbol of peace. It was a promise that what is broken can bloom again. And as the wind moved through its branches, it carried the memory of a woman who was gone but never forgotten. If you were in Charles's place, would you have chosen justice or forgiveness? Could you let go of anger to find peace? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Because every story of revenge is really a story about the heart learning how to forgive. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more family revenge stories filled with redemption, truth, and the kind of justice that leaves no scars, only lessons. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Tell us what forgiveness means to you.